We think of isolation as being in a corner.
Yeah.
It can just be shutting down.
It's just that's right. The shutdown of inability or unwillingness to relate.
Yeah.
And then that becomes a groove that just is in some way chosen.
Yeah.
And then it's not. Then it becomes the automatic. With God, there is always more. More love, more life, more freedom. Welcome to Zoweh's Exploring More with Michael Thompson. C.S. Lewis once wrote, "Our Heavenly Father has provided many delightful ends for us along our journey, but He takes great care to see that we do not mistake any of them for home." Join me and the team as we explore the kingdom together, discovering the deep truths and offering encouragement for the journey. There is always more. Welcome back to the Exploring More podcast, and we are looking at isolation in marriage as one of our significant subjects, a place where, this can grow like weeds in your grass, in terms of I don't seem to plant that. It just comes in different seasons, and all of a sudden there they all are. And I have to tend to them, or else it will overrun things, right?
Yeah.
And so you guys had some thoughts about what maybe at the break, what you wanted to jump in with. Fire away.
Sure. First of all, I love that you just used the word tend. Mm-hmm. That's a really good one.
I think of gardening and think of the garden of my heart.
Attending to sounds like an awareness of something that comes up in me, a paying attention, a curiosity, and an exploration of and care of. All that sounds like tending. And so the thing that a story came to my mind as you were just talking before the break, Michael, and I thought about what this looks like for me, for us. And I thought of an example that happened a few years back, probably about 2 years back, because it was when I was starting to start to pay attention of where in my story have these wounds, where did they come from, and how I'm moving in relationships now a direct result of some of those things that I wasn't even aware of them at the time. But I remember one day in the kitchen, you came, we were talking, and something I said was the poke against a bruise. Yeah. And it was just an innocent thing for me. It was just in a conversation, but what it touched on ran deep for you, and it really did run deep. Mm-hmm. And you came back with such energy, understandably so, but in my story, that energy feels very familiar. It feels like the anger and the rage that I experienced from my dad. And what it did to me and does to me now is silences me and shuts me down. And I freeze, and I try to please. I try to do whatever it takes to not be in that position anymore, because it feels very helpless. And so I remember that moment, and I remember just going dark. I remember how isolating that felt to me. I felt really alone. And, but then as I moved more in that, it took me a while, but God was taking me into places of more awareness and curiosity of, okay, that feels familiar. And I am moving in places, I'm able to, because I have been engaging my story, understanding more of the harm and how it manifests itself now in me. And the false self for me looks like hiding, pleasing, smoothing over, flying under the radar, and then I get really small. I lose my voice, and I just give way to because I don't want to bump up against that energy again. So for me, that kind of a scenario, even though it doesn't happen often for us, that is one of the things that moves me towards isolation. And then the invitation is coming for me in how can I respond to you? Maybe it takes a day. Maybe it takes an hour. Wouldn't it be great if it took a moments? But where I could say, I need to talk with you about this. This is how I'm feeling. This is what this is like for me. And can we have a conversation about it?
Yeah. I remember that moment, and it's how fast it can go. And this is, we're not trying to avoid the details. I think what we're trying to do is make sure that we can cover how quick this can go. So I felt criticized in a way that brought about the reaction. And then the reaction created the energy that shut down. And that's what we mean. That's literally what we mean by false self. False self summons false self. And because the false self is made up of these wounding messages and these spells that you actually kind of carry with you and live under, we do a good job of kind of keeping them, kind of out of the way. I think knowing that, that kind of anger or that kind of fear, we wouldn't want to operate that way. And then some people don't hide them very well. They're kind of out front of how they're relating. But I think about how quickly, this can happen. And then what happens next? Like you said, false self in the first segment, false self. And then do we recover from not only the bruises that were there, but, you hit a bruise pretty good, it's going to bruise again. It's going to be more tender. It's going to recovery is going to depend on where you both move. Go from there. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
So I have a question for you. You go ahead. But I have a question for the two of you guys, because we've talked about this, but I'd love to hear what you guys think. Is there a stage of your life that you think generally you reach where you're willing to get up on the observation deck? So what I mean by the observation deck, for those that don't know what I'm talking about, is just like you talked about, Robin, that moment of, okay, I am self-isolating here in a protective manner. It's old. It feels like I've been doing it forever. And at some point, you became aware of that operational system in your life. And that's what I mean by the observation deck. You're kind of up out of it, and you're watching yourself go through that process or in that system, right? So do you guys think it's a stage of life that you come to when you're something years old? Or is it just the journey of your life? Would a 25-year-old get up on the observation deck? I mean, what do you guys think?
I think it's when we become awakened to what this is, what's going on, what is happening. I think it's an awakening where the Spirit of God gives us eyes to see, and when we're ready. Yeah. A combination of all of it. But I think in this story, it felt like safety to me to isolate. Right. It felt like that feels safer. And so part of the awakening for me is I can see how I have gone to this place of trying to keep myself safe, but I realized I was keeping myself small and silent. Mm-hmm.
Because I was
not a practiced way.
Well, I was
it
doing
is
the
a
same
practiced
thing.
way
From your childhood.
From my childhood, absolutely.
No longer.
No longer.
You're safe, but you're dying inside.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I was trying to protect myself by that expression of, hey, it was move at and dukes up rather than, a retreat. So and then that dynamic happens. It's not good. I mean, those things aren't.
They're both isolating.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So, and Robin didn't run out of the room. I mean, but she's isolating in this place, and then so's the loud guy. He's we think of isolation as being in a corner.
Yeah,
it can just be shutting down.
It's just that's right, the shut down of inability or unwillingness to relate, and then that becomes a groove that just is in some way chosen. Yeah, and then it's not. Then it becomes the automatic. Go ahead.
What do you think, Sherry?
Well, I think about what you shared and how nuanced that is, and that's something that you could experience only now. You couldn't have experienced that 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I think back to a time before we had access to any of what you just described or the observation deck. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think back to early in our marriage, and it's something that we've talked about where we see the schism of isolation started. I think back to the altar you were talking about and how there were 4 of us there, our true selves and our false selves.
Right down the aisle.
Right down the aisle. And there was a time in our marriage where my false self became aware that Scott was smoking. And for me, that was a non-starter. That just was not going to happen. I was
both your parents smoked for years and you hated it.
It was disgusting. I hated it. Not happening. And couldn't have a conversation about it. I mean, I just declared that this was not happening. And what did that cause? Scott to hide. And then all of a sudden, there's a part of his life that I don't have access to, and he's hiding from me. And I, to some degree, don't blame him. I was not remotely kind about it or considering any other way about it. But the isolation just mounts and mounts and mounts because there's no safety.
Rock after rock after rock.
Right, until you talk about when do you have the awareness for an observation deck. I don't know that I had an awareness for an observation deck, but I just got to a place where it's like, there's got to be more to marriage than this. Than this living separate lives, this moving in different ways, this not being able to have a conversation. We had great times together, but we had some really horrific times together. Yeah,
and we didn't have intimacy.
No.
Right? So there was a lack of intimacy, and we were together, and there was physical intimacy, but we didn't know one another. We weren't heart connected.
Our false selves were.
We've got a few friends of ours who are pilots, and when you're a pilot, if you deviate just 1 degree off of your course,
you won't end up.
It's not a big deal at the beginning, but after you go 10,000 miles, you are 10,000 miles off course in the wrong direction. So I used to talk about the way that Sherry and I came down off the altar after getting married. Shortly after we did, we were side by side at first heading in the same direction, but shortly after we got married, we kind of just slightly turned away from each other. Just a little bit. But over the course of 14 years, we are now miles apart. I went west and she went east, and
because we didn't
there was a schism between us.
Right, and we didn't have any access to recovery, as you were talking about, because you were talking about how do you repair that? How do you recover that? And the start of that journey for us was me getting to a place where there's got to be more to this and starting to do what you were talking about, your own work, my own work.
Yeah.
Well, how did we get here? And having a nun say, well, you know how you got here? You got here because you're being his mother, not his mom, not his wife, and he needs you to be his wife. And so that may not have been the kindest way to say it, but it got my attention.
That's interesting.
Sent me into a space of how did
examination,
I get this way?
Right? Exploration.
Did I think that this was a way to operate in marriage, to be intimate with my husband?
Thank you for sharing that, because it takes me back to if our premarital counseling or even the last few minutes of the marriage ceremony, the pastor or the priest would say, "Okay, now, just let me let you know that this is going to not go well from time to time."
FYI.
And but who says that? It's
right,
such a blissful.
But who believes it? If you were to say it, I'd be like, we got this.
Yeah, we would have
this all figured out.
We're different.
Else. Yeah.
Yes.
So that answers your question.
I've got a plan. I've got a plan.
We just took the volume meters on the podcast.
We did, sorry.
But that goes back to how old do you have to be? To get to that place. How old do you have to be? And we've seen stories. We've seen stories that we've watched these stories. One of the hardest ones that I ever saw, and I couldn't watch it.
Oh, you're talking about a movie?
Yeah, a story, Revolutionary Road.
Yeah.
I mean, that is isolation on
Doing all the things that you think you're supposed to do because now you're married and you're starting a family, and it just brings this hopelessness. Yeah.
And then I think of another story that we've talked about and shown in some of our conferences. Shall We Dance?
Oh yeah.
Susan Sarandon and Richard Gere. He plays John and she plays Beverly. Mm-hmm. And they're in that isolation space. I remember the scene where she hires a private investigator because something's wrong with him. She thinks he's having an affair, and he's probably going through some midlife things, which is a code for the invitation to the observation deck.
Right, right.
But
there's been a change in his countenance for some reason, and she doesn't know why, because it's not, as far as she knows, it's not her.
Or she wonders, back to the wondering of it, so that, interestingly enough, he begins to move at this dance studio, I think with her in mind, but there's something that he's trying to break free from. And so, anyway, as the story goes, the private investigator's hired, they meet, and she finds out that he's not having an affair. He is taking dance classes, But she says a line in there. He asks her, "Why do you think people get married?" No, she asks him.
Investigator does.
She asks him, "Why do you think people, get married?" You remember what she says?
Mm-hmm.
What?
We need a witness to our lives.
Yeah, that's what she,
every part of it, the mundane, the glorious. She reads this list.
I think that clip ought to be shown. In the premarital space of here's what 15 or 20 years can look like, and here's what you signed up for, and how do you stay, on that course, because it's a very challenging course. I think of, you said flying, I think of sailing. You've got to take a lot of things into account, the tide, the size of the waves, the current, the wind. When you think about sailing, and you got to you can't just fly a plane without kind of flying it, to get to where you want to go. Right. You've got to be able to tack, and you've got to be able to, readjust your position. And I think this idea of fighting against this common enemy of isolation. Can we turn into that a little bit?
Well, I was just going to say, when you just said about Beverly and John and the list of things and the witness to your life, we all need that. That to me speaks of being seen and being known and intimacy. And we all want that.
It's a great story that
and we're made for that.
That brings without spoiling the ending, different than Revolutionary Road. It has a very different ending, but it shows the effect of the man experiencing and wrestling with isolation and not telling her, and how it affects her. And now both of them are questioning and concerned and aren't trusting and aren't sure. I mean, it brings those things that is actually creating a greater wedge. And then when the exposure comes, you have to watch the movie. But
is there a movie clip that you guys think of as we're talking about this? That
from that movie?
From any movie, from any story. We use, for those of you that are new to the podcast, we like to think of movies as modern day parables. And so they're stealing stuff from God. They're stealing the greatest story ever told, right? Of redemption and resolution. So any clips?
I was just fully engrossed in that one. My brain's still there.
I think of a movie.
Richard Gere coming up on the escalator and then dancing with her. Oh my gosh, it's beautiful.
The end. Beautiful. Okay, yeah, that's the end of the movie. In case you hadn't seen it before. But, okay, no spoiler. It's been out for 20-something years.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
This another one. Bruce Willis and Michelle Pfeiffer. The Story of Us.
Story of Us.
It's a rough movie to watch, but so we wouldn't recommend the whole of some of these movies. But the last few minutes of that movie, where they're about to get divorced, and then she chooses to risk kind of why she doesn't want to give up on their marriage, and she goes on this whole emotional speech about, she doesn't want to learn someone new. She knows where the Band-Aids are, things like that. It's a great clip. Yeah. That's right.
Have you seen that? I haven't seen it.
Me moo. Yeah.
So
Anyway.
we got a few minutes left.
Yeah.
And I just want to devote them to, this is a hard subject, and it's a hard place to be. Where have we found hope, or where have we found encouragement, or how have we found God to meet us in some of those courageous steps? Anything that you can offer at this point in helping bring an end to isolation, or at least a turn from the current direction and the ways things are going in a marriage, or in your own heart or life, or in your partner's.
Yeah, maybe think about, the person that's listening to this podcast because they found it found them, right? God arranged for them to find this. What would you say to that person that is hopeful to try to find relief from feeling isolated in the context of their marriage, right?
Well, I can think of two things, and I'll let you talk about one, and then I can talk about the other. For me, I think about a turning point for us, only 5 years ago, when we started exploring some of the Enneagram. We started exploring with Jesus our own hearts and each other's hearts with some language from the Enneagram that really helped us to see, to hear each other, to understand, put words around how I was experiencing your intensity as anger because of where anger is in my story.
Right.
And being able to better discern, do my own exploration of why, what anger does to me when I perceive it coming against me, and understanding that you're intense. And sometimes your intensity may look like anger, but having that understanding. So the Enneagram helped us to see each other differently and move with each other differently, instead of, for the last 30 years, you trying to convince me that you're not angry, you're just intense. This gave us
getting more intense as I'm trying to tell you I'm not being intense.
Yeah. And this gave us so much language around that and insight into why you're intense, and the invitation to go back into our stories with Jesus, the Enneagram.
Yeah, can I respond to that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Depends what you're going to say. No.
Well, it's just interesting the way that you said, you thought I remember standing in the kitchen and you just saying to me, well, I just thought you were angry for 25 years. And my response to that internally, and as I've continued to explore and kind of unearth some things about you, my interpretation of you was that nobody could do it right except for you. Whatever we were talking about, you were the only one that could do it the right way.
Right. And what did you learn?
I learned that that's an externalized judgment that's centered really on yourself. That you feel like you have to have everything just right. Otherwise you're not lovable.
Right. I'm my biggest critic. Can you just join in the voices?
Yeah. So, I mean, that, I don't know if we're conveying the importance of how
Sound like me.
All right, Ted.
I don't know that we're conveying the importance of unlocking that in our relationship, because coming to that recognition of, for 3 decades, operating that way and having those judgments and opinions about one another, and kind of being open to the idea that maybe this isn't as true as we think it is, or maybe it doesn't mean what we think it means, was hugely helpful to us. Again, going back to the observation deck and being willing to pull back from it and be open to the idea that what we believe is true may not be the truth about one another or about ourselves.
And it can be real. You can be experiencing. You're experiencing it that way.
It feels very real.
Yeah, I think about some marriages just to even have a conversation in the kitchen and stay there, or to have that moment of exchange. You may need you may need a resource or another person to step in and help, because what we're describing, what I felt and heard in some of this, and want to be sensitive to somebody in a marriage or two people in a marriage that are feeling the isolation, is that it's very challenging to be objective when you're subject to the pain and the hurt, and you see this other person as a cause of that, and maybe they're bumping into something from your past that's very legitimate, but they're bumping into something currently of your past. And why do you keep bumping into that? Why, so I think about how quickly the spiral can go down. And I think, one of my encouragements would be, you may need to take that courageous, vulnerable step of counsel or a resource that you can kind of step into subjectively together, have some rules of engagement. Let's just watch this. I think of the Rendezvous project that we made, or I think of the journals, the My Wife and the My Husband journals, just a tool to get into one another's story. At the same time, we've made it very clear, you probably have to do some work on your own, of your own. So I think of, doing the deepening journey as a woman, going through the heart of a warrior and the journal workbook as a man.
Sure.
And I know I have talked to men, I haven't talked to any women about this yet, but I have talked to men who said, a book, really? A journal, really? And I kind of like, really? What else you got to do?
Okay, what have you got to lose?
And you're, and that's not I'm not trying to be snarky, when I say that, but and then I would just add, and then Rob, what do you want to share as encouragement and solution and hope? Is there is a God who's near the brokenhearted. There is a God that I think an honest cry of the heart prayer. Would you meet me here? Where are you? Where are you, God? Would you help me? I need. And if you've listened to this podcast and you're kind of at the end and hearing that, maybe that's where you begin. And it feels so, what's the word? When you're isolated, there's a helplessness that you feel.
Sure.
And
Hopeless and helpless.
And here we are saying, if you got 1 ounce of courage left, if you got one just morsel of hope, this is a direction that I think you can step. And we're praying that the Lord will bring the road, meet your feet will meet the road. The road will meet your feet, in that space. And because it's not easy when you get under these spells and you get in this entrapping space to get out of that. But, if the door opened, would you even notice? Would you even be able to get out of that cage and into that space? So I don't know how God might arrange for that as we offer different encouragements and hopes and solutions. What were you thinking?
So, Michael, when you say that, what would we say to the person who just feels hopeless? And I'm thinking it starts with yourself, because you cannot change your spouse. You cannot fix your spouse. It starts with you and doing your own work and acknowledging that you are on your journey and your spouse is on his or her journey. And yes, we live with them and we come alongside them and we are for them, but you can't change them. So it's you and Jesus.
Yeah,
help me.
There's a I don't know how to say it. There's a misbelief or a
false belief.
False belief. Thank you. I don't think misbelief is actually a word, but that in order for you to work on your marriage or for your marriage to receive any kind of healing, that both people from the get-go have to both say, okay, we're both going to make this better. And I think at some point, yes, both people do have to engage, but it's not always at the same moment, at the same time. That was not our experience. Sherry engaged in it long before I did. And then I was moved to work on it too. So it's not relying on one person to do it and, all the work and make it better. But it's also not, I think there's this false belief that that you both have to move at the same time in lockstep towards healing in order for healing to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's true.
Mm-hmm. And so I mentioned the Enneagram. The other thing I was thinking about was the listening guide. And Robin, you have worked on that listening guide, and we've been exploring how important listening is.
Yeah.
And I think that's, want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, you've done a lot of refining to
Yeah.
it, so it's, tell us more about that.
I've really loved the exploration, what I've learned and what I'm learning. Like Sherry, you said, it's a continual, ongoing practice. And I think one of the most valuable things in terms of listening is to truly be present, learning how to be present to what the other person is saying verbally and non-verbally, and just being present, listening with the intent to understand, to hear Michael. Not like what I realized about myself is I sit listening, waiting for him to stop talking so I can offer some kind of, actually a defense. That's how I learned. I need to defend myself. I need to explain myself. I need to give reasons. But actually, especially if you're sharing something that you have felt, that you have experienced, when I share my own reasons and my own explanation and my defenses, that just takes the focus totally off you and puts it on me. I haven't heard you. I'm not loving you well, really. I'm self-protecting.
I forgive you.
But to be able to...
It's a way people dance and step on each other's toes. It's
Everybody
really,
does it.
And I wait to give advice. I wait to defend myself against what I perceive as a threat or accusation, and I also wait to give advice to you and make you better. But truly being able to listen, and it has been because of the work that I'm doing in an ongoing way where I'm able to, okay, this relationship doesn't feel threatened to me like I know in my body and in my story, because of the places that I've moved and the healing that I'm experiencing. I can be able to listen to Michael in a way that seeks to understand, and because I know your heart. Sometimes people are in relationships that are not safe. And so I want to say that. Then it's not just simply about just understanding. And to your point, there are counselors and therapists who can help with those kinds of...
Well, and it's more than listening, right? Because we talked about there is the significance and the importance of naming what you've just heard.
Yes.
Reflecting
as you listen.
back.
Yes, it's a way of listening.
Acknowledging, validating what you're feeling.
Yes.
Because I think sometimes we're so quick to say, oh, don't feel that way. Oh, don't. Right. And it's just like, oh.
You shouldn't feel that.
Right. You shouldn't feel that. Why
the
are
worst.
you?
We try to rescue. We try to fix.
Right.
Solve.
Instead of just saying, wow, that is really hard. I can see where that's really challenging. Or
And questions. Right? Tell me more about that. Is it okay if I respond to that? Right? I mean.
Huge.
Yes. Questions are
huge.
The
challenge with that encouragement and the invitation of that encouragement are kind of both in the same, where you get to learn to do this, you get to practice, and for a while it will be a switch that you flip. And you'll do it with your kids, but you won't do it with your spouse. Or you'll do it with your best friend, but not with your spouse. And that's okay for a time, but there has to come a time when your spouse gets the best, not the leftovers.
And that's been true in our story.
And that's been part of the process. You know, you go away on a weekend and you learn some of that training in a counseling environment for, how to handle someone's heart. And, as we've said, that you realize, oh my gosh, what have I been doing to my kids? What have I been doing, to my friends? And we were talking about this very thing with a couple of our friends, you with your friend, me with my friend, just different. And gosh, what a great listener you are to your friend.
Chopped liver.
Yeah. And I was actually saying that about me. You know, I can give some of my most patient, most kind, and most loving, you know, engagement to one of my buddies, you know, who wants to talk, and not to the one that I promised and went down the aisle with. And so the last thing that I think I want to say is this may be the strongest and most courageous thing you can do for now if you're in a marriage and you're in isolation. And that would be to find a journal that you like the looks of, and begin to write, begin to express what you're feeling, what you're thinking. You know, again, if it's not safe, that's another level of trauma and challenge. But so you don't have, it's not a diary. You're not hiding something. You're actually getting something in the light. You're expressing it for the day that you might have some courage to find a counselor or a good listening friend, and you have your thoughts and you have your record, and maybe you've had it for a week, maybe you've had it for a couple weeks, but I think it's a baby step, pun intended. You know, it's a baby step towards this is how I'm feeling, this is what I'm thinking. And observing those thoughts and observing those feelings and getting those on paper, getting them out of you,
yes, huge,
and into a place is maybe one of the if I was going to be your counselor, and you wanted to have that conversation, I would make that assignment. I would say, could you write down for me, just in between our next meeting, could you write down for me what you're feeling and what you're thinking? Could you kind of keep it handy? You know, don't do it at stoplights. Don't do it. But could you give some attention? Could you make the courageous step? And would you honor me by writing down some of the way you're feeling and some of the way you're thinking? Because I wanna understand, and I want, and then what I really want is I want them to see and hear. There's words that articulate, and words matter. And so that's a place that I would really encourage anybody in isolation, whether you're a man, whether you're a woman, or you're in a marriage that's experiencing that. I think that's a very courageous place to start. And maybe it's a pretty big hill to climb, but I'm hopeful that there's something manageable about that. So, hopefully that gives you some direction to go. And as you've said, SJ, at the end of every podcast, as we close this one out, call us.
Yeah, shoot us an email, exploring more at Zoweh.org.
Go ahead.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, man. I mean, 100%, we don't want people to listen to a podcast about isolation and then feel more isolated because they don't have anybody to talk to. So shoot us an email, exploring more at Zoweh.org. And if you would, share the podcast on your platform of choice. We're on YouTube now, so you could share that link, and we're still up on all the different audio platforms. So give us a rate review. It helps us to be found. Yeah.
So, it's our hope and prayer that the dark days of isolation, that help is coming, and that you would take that courageous step toward it, and that somehow, some way, in that prayer of heartache, God, where are you? Would you come for me? That He will. And so that's our hope. And if we can be a part of that, like SJ said, we'd love to be in your corner. So until next time, Michael Thompson and the team signing off for the Exploring More podcast. We'll see you next time.
We hope you have enjoyed this episode of Exploring More. The landing page for this podcast is zoweh.org/podcast. That's ZOWEH.org/podcast, where you can find the show notes and various platforms to which we broadcast. You can also find us and the Life of More by visiting Zoweh on YouVersion Bible app, Right Now Media, our Facebook page, and Zoweh on Instagram and Twitter. Remember, with God there is always more, and you were made for more.